The final goodbye, when a divorce turns deadly. Criminal story. Kelly had always imagined her life unfolding like a soft, predictable rhythm, a steady beat of home-cooked meals, family vacations, and the cozy comforts of a two-parent household. She wasn't one to crave drama or unpredictability. In fact, she found solace in the routine of her life with Thomas and their two children, Emma and James. For years, their small suburban home had been her sanctuary, the walls filled with the laughter of children, the scent of freshly baked bread, and the hum of the dishwasher as it cycled through after dinner. Kelly felt as though she had found her place in the world. This was her domain, her comfort zone, where she could wear the role of mother and wife with pride, if not always with fulfillment. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. At first, her marriage to Thomas had been full of promise. They had met in college, Kelly, a bright, eager student studying education, and Thomas, a confident, slightly older man who worked as a junior architect. Their connection had been instant, an intoxicating blend of chemistry and shared ideals about family, love, and ambition. After a whirlwind romance, they married just before Kelly graduated, and Thomas landed a solid job in a local architectural firm. For Kelly, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she hoped to create a life of stability and happiness, one filled with the joy of raising a family. The first few years of their marriage had been full of excitement and idealism. Thomas was charming, attentive, and, by all accounts, a loving husband. He had always been a man of ambition, driven to make something of himself, and Kelly admired his work ethic. They bought a modest house on the outskirts of the city and began their family. Their first child, Emma, was born shortly after they settled into their new home. Kelly had always wanted to be a mother, and the arrival of Emma was the culmination of a long-held dream. The small moments, Emma's first steps, her first words, her first day of kindergarten, filled Kelly with a sense of pride and fulfillment. They seemed like the milestones of a perfect life. But the idyllic years of early motherhood slowly began to erode under the weight of responsibilities. As Emma grew, and Kelly became more deeply entrenched in her role as a full-time mother, something inside her began to shift. The house grew quieter, the moments of joy seemed fewer, and the arguments between her and Thomas started to surface more frequently. At first, it was small things, misunderstandings over chores, Thomas's long work hours, and Kelly's occasional frustration with the endless cycle of domesticity. But as time wore on, these disagreements became more frequent, more intense. Kelly often found herself feeling invisible, as if she were fading into the background of her own life. While Thomas threw himself into his career, often staying late at the office or traveling for business, Kelly was left at home, taking care of the children, cleaning, cooking, and managing the household. She didn't resent the responsibilities, but there was an underlying sense of isolation that began to take hold of her. As much as she loved her children, she also began to feel the weight of never-ending sacrifice. It was as if her own needs, desires, and identity had been submerged beneath the roles of wife and mother. And in that silence, Thomas had become more distant, more absorbed in his own world, leaving Kelly to quietly wonder where she fit into the equation. The shift was subtle at first. Thomas's long hours were excused by his drive to provide for the family, and Kelly, ever the patient wife, accepted this reasoning. She rationalized it by telling herself that he was just busy with work and that things would get better once he had more time. But as the years went by, Kelly began to question whether his absence was a symptom of something deeper. Their conversations grew shorter, their interactions more strained. The affection that once characterized their relationship began to dwindle. The late nights at the office became frequent weekends away, and Kelly's unease grew. The tipping point came when Kelly discovered that Thomas had been having an affair. It wasn't something she suspected immediately, not because she was blind to the possibility, but because she had resigned herself to a life of quiet dissatisfaction. She had stopped expecting much from Thomas emotionally, and that was her defense mechanism. But one day, when she found a hotel receipt in his coat pocket, the truth came crashing down. It wasn't a single, innocent mistake. It was months of deception. The realization shattered Kelly's already fragile sense of security. Her heart ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the feeling that the person she had once trusted with her life and her dreams had chosen someone else. In the wake of the discovery, Kelly found herself at a crossroads. She could no longer deny the reality of her marriage. It was not the partnership she had once believed in. She had built her entire life around the idea of a family, and now that was in jeopardy. But she also knew that ending her marriage would be devastating, not just for her, but for Emma and James. Divorce, she believed, would tear apart the very fabric of their family life. So, she did what she had always done. She suppressed her emotions, buried her pain, and carried on. It was easier that way, wasn't it? She could remain in the marriage for the sake of the children. She could weather the storm and keep her family intact, no matter the cost to her heart. Kelly's decision to stay with Thomas after the affair wasn't one of forgiveness or even hope for reconciliation. It was one of survival. She told herself that the children needed both of their parents, that the disruption of a divorce would hurt them more than the quiet unhappiness she had come to accept. Thomas, for his part, seemed remorseful at first. He apologized, promised that it was a mistake, and assured her that he would never make such a mistake again. But deep down, Kelly knew that things had irrevocably changed. The trust between them had been broken, and no amount of apologies could fix it. As the months wore on, Kelly found herself falling deeper into the role she had played for years: mom, wife, caretaker, while her own needs were increasingly ignored. Her personal identity, once vibrant and full of potential, had withered under the weight of her responsibilities. She was no longer Kelly, the woman who had dreams, who had once stood on the edge of the future with ambition in her heart. She had become a caretaker, a wife, a mother, roles that she had slipped into without ever really choosing them. And all the while, Thomas seemed more distant, more absorbed in his own world. His career flourished, but at the expense of their marriage. Kelly's sense of self was shrinking, and she had started to wonder if this was all there was for her. Would she simply fade away, one day forgotten, living a life defined by obligations rather than desires? Despite these creeping doubts, Kelly couldn't bring herself to take the final step of ending the marriage. She had built a life with Thomas, and their children were her world. The idea of disrupting their lives, of tearing apart the family they had once been, filled her with a deep sense of guilt. She had always been the one to hold everything together. How could she abandon that role now, especially when Emma and James still looked to her for stability? But there was a growing dissonance between the life Kelly had imagined and the life she was living. The more she ignored the pain of her marriage, the more it seemed to haunt her, lingering in the background like an unspoken truth. She found herself yearning for something more, for a sense of liberation, but was paralyzed by the fear of what would happen if she took the leap. Would her children be better off? Would she be able to rebuild her life? Or was it too late? The answers eluded her, as did the courage to confront the reality of her situation. In a strange way, Kelly's life had become a carefully constructed illusion. She wasn't living the life she had dreamed of, nor was she living the life she had been taught to expect. She was merely surviving, navigating the space between what was and what could have been. Her comfort zone wasn't a place of contentment. It was a place of quiet resignation, where she could hold onto the familiar even as everything inside her screamed for change. The discovery of Thomas's affair had shaken Kelly to her core, but it was not the singular event that defined the end of their marriage. It was the culmination of years of unmet needs, broken promises, and a slow unraveling of trust. For a long time, Kelly had convinced herself that she could tolerate the emotional distance between them, that she could remain patient and allow Thomas to return to her, to their family, in his own time. After all, this was how things were supposed to go. You weathered the rough patches, you stuck it out for the kids, and you didn't make hasty decisions based on temporary emotions. She had been taught that marriage was a commitment, a bond that shouldn't be severed just because things got difficult. But that day, when she found the hotel receipt and the text messages that confirmed her worst fears, Kelly's worldview shifted. The rationalizations, the denial, the excuses, none of them could protect her anymore. What she had once believed was a minor hiccup in their marriage was actually a symptom of something far more insidious. The affair was not just a betrayal of her trust, it was the breaking point, the proof that their relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Kelly now understood that she had been living in a carefully constructed illusion, a reality built on false hope and unspoken compromises. And while she had been trying to hold everything together, Thomas had been quietly unraveling it all, one decision at a time. But it wasn't just the affair that pushed Kelly to a decision. It was the culmination of years of resentment, frustration, and the realization that she had been sacrificing her own happiness and identity for far too long. She had spent so much time trying to please Thomas, trying to be the perfect wife and mother, that she had forgotten who she was as an individual. She had lost sight of her own needs, her own desires, and in the process, had allowed Thomas to dominate their marriage in ways that were subtle but profound. She had allowed him to define her world, her choices, and her reality. But no longer. Kelly's first step in reclaiming her power was a quiet, internal one. She knew she couldn't continue living in this toxic, fractured marriage. The thought of living with Thomas any longer felt suffocating. She could no longer bear the weight of the lies, the betrayal, and the emotional neglect. But even as she made the decision to leave, she knew it would not be easy. The road ahead was fraught with complications, most of all the children. Emma and James were everything to Kelly. Her love for them was the most constant thing in her life. She had always been the one to care for them, to nurture them, to ensure they felt safe and loved. But now, with the prospect of a divorce looming over her, Kelly had to face a gut-wrenching reality. She had to fight for them. For years, Thomas had been an absentee father, emotionally unavailable and detached from the day-to-day responsibilities of raising their children. He had always claimed that his work was his priority, that his long hours and frequent business trips were necessary for their financial security. Kelly had accepted this excuse for a long time, believing that as long as the bills were paid and their material needs were met, she could handle the rest. She never once questioned the unequal division of labor in their home, the way she bore the brunt of the emotional and practical responsibilities of raising their children while Thomas remained distant, seemingly uninterested in their lives outside of his own career. But now, faced with the prospect of splitting their family apart, Kelly realized something. Thomas, despite his apparent indifference, would not simply let go of his children. The idea of losing them, of being reduced to a weekend visitor, or, worse, having no access to them at all, filled him with rage. Kelly knew him well enough to understand that he was driven by control, by the need to maintain dominance in every situation. And this divorce, this breakup of their family, threatened his control in ways nothing else had before. He wouldn't go down without a fight, and Kelly had no illusions about that. At first, Kelly didn't know how to proceed. She had always been a peacemaker, a person who avoided conflict whenever possible. Her instincts told her to try to make the divorce as amicable as possible, to avoid making waves for the sake of the children. But then, as the reality of her situation set in, Kelly realized that she couldn't afford to be passive any longer. Her children, her family, her future, these were stakes far too high for compromise. She had spent years bending to Thomas's will, compromising her own dreams and desires for the sake of keeping the peace, of maintaining a facade of a happy family. But she was done with that. She had nothing left to lose. The decision to fight for full custody was not an easy one. Kelly knew that Thomas would not take it lying down. He had always seen himself as the more powerful, more important parent. After all, he was the one who provided financially, the one who worked the long hours, the one who had the authority. Kelly had always been the caretaker, the nurturer, the one who ran the household. But she now understood that she had to redefine her own role. She was not just a mother. She was a force to be reckoned with. And if it meant going up against Thomas in a battle for custody, then that's what she would do. But the emotional cost of this decision weighed heavily on her. Kelly had always believed in the importance of family, in the ideal of a two-parent household. She had always hoped that Emma and James would grow up in a home where their parents were together, where they could see the model of a stable, loving relationship. She had dreamed of their future, of birthdays and holidays shared as a family, of them growing up with both parents present and involved in their lives. And yet, as she stared at the cold, hard reality of her situation, Kelly realized that this ideal had never truly existed. The image of the family she had once cherished was now a lie, a memory that no longer held any meaning. Her decision to seek full custody was not driven by a desire for revenge, but by a need to protect her children. Kelly had witnessed firsthand the emotional distance between Thomas and the children. He had never been the kind of father who played with them on the floor, who asked about their day, who tucked them in at night, and kissed them goodnight. He had always been distant, more concerned with his own ambitions than the needs of his family. In contrast, Kelly had always been present for Emma and James. She was the one who took them to school, who helped them with their homework, who attended parent-teacher conferences and soccer games. She was the one who knew their fears, their dreams, their favorite foods. She was their rock. But even more than that, Kelly knew that her children needed stability. They needed consistency and security. Thomas, with his erratic behavior and emotional volatility, was not capable of providing that. The thought of leaving them alone with him, of them being subjected to his emotional manipulation and control, was more than Kelly could bear. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let him continue to dominate their lives in the same way he had dominated their marriage. At the same time, Kelly felt guilty. She wondered whether she was making the right decision, whether it was truly in Emma and James's best interests to go through a bitter custody battle. Divorce was painful enough, but a custody fight would add another layer of trauma. She questioned whether she was being selfish, whether she was putting her own desires for independence above the well-being of her children. But in the end, she knew she couldn't let Thomas win. This was not just about a divorce. This was about reclaiming her life, her autonomy, and, most importantly, her children's future. Kelly's decision to seek full custody was the catalyst for everything that followed. It set in motion a chain of events that would forever change her life, her relationship with Thomas, and the lives of Emma and James. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with legal battles, emotional struggles, and heartache. But for the first time in years, Kelly felt a sense of clarity and determination. She was no longer the passive participant in her life. She was fighting for something she believed in. She was fighting for her children, for her future, and for the chance to rebuild a life she could call her own. Kelly's decision to seek full custody of Emma and James was a turning point. No longer willing to live in the shadow of Thomas's dominance and deception, she had committed herself to taking back control of her life. But the fight for custody would not be easy, and Kelly quickly learned that the process would thrust her into an unfamiliar and often brutal world. What she had once imagined as a straightforward legal proceeding turned out to be a complex, emotionally draining struggle that tested her resolve at every turn. At first, Kelly felt a strange sense of clarity, almost as if she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. It was a line that divided the passive, resigned version of herself from the determined, empowered woman she was becoming. As soon as she made the decision to fight for full custody, Kelly took the first step by consulting a lawyer. The legal landscape was an alien territory to her. She had never imagined she would need legal counsel in her life, especially when it came to something as deeply personal as her children's future. But the reality of divorce, especially one involving children, was far more complicated than she had anticipated. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rebecca, wasted no time explaining the stakes. The law, Rebecca explained, was not always on the side of the mother, despite society's assumptions. Custody battles were often brutal, with a parent who could afford the best legal representation and who could manipulate the court system to their advantage coming out on top. It was a harsh truth, but Kelly understood immediately that her fight was going to require more than just a simple desire to do the right thing. She had to be strategic, organized, and ready for a long, emotionally exhausting fight. Thomas had already hired one of the best family law attorneys in town, a man known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to win at any cost. Kelly's stomach turned when she learned about Thomas's choice of lawyer. She had hoped that the divorce could be civil, that it could end amicably for the sake of the children. But with his choice of counsel, it became clear that Thomas was ready for a war, not a negotiation. He had no intention of letting her have the upper hand. The first court date loomed large on the horizon, and Kelly could feel the pressure building. Every day felt like a countdown to something uncertain, something she couldn't fully control. She found herself reading up on the nuances of family law, studying cases of child custody disputes, and even attending support groups for women in similar situations. She was determined to be as prepared as possible. But no amount of reading or preparation could fully shield her from the emotional turmoil of the situation. It was not just the legal battle that unsettled her. It was the fact that she was now actively going against Thomas in a way that was so foreign to her. For years, Kelly had been the one to acquiesce, the one to make peace when tensions ran high, the one who bent over backward to maintain the appearance of a happy family. She had always been the caretaker, the one who smoothed over the rough patches, who kept the household functioning despite their growing unhappiness. Now, she was forced to confront the reality that her entire life with Thomas had been built on an unequal partnership, one in which she had sacrificed her own needs for the sake of his desires. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Kelly had never seen herself as a fighter. She had been a nurturer, a mother, a wife, but never a combatant in a legal battle. Yet, here she was, thrust into a situation that required her to fight for the thing she loved most, her children. The first court hearing was a blur. Kelly arrived at the courthouse early, her stomach a knot of anxiety. She had spent the night before rehearsing what she would say, mentally preparing herself for the weight of the proceedings. As she walked through the sterile hallways of the courthouse, she could feel the cold weight of the building pressing down on her, reminding her that her fight was not just about her and Thomas. It was about the future of her children, about a battle for control over their lives. In the courtroom, Kelly sat at a small table with Rebecca, surrounded by legal documents, notes, and a thick stack of evidence she had gathered over the past few weeks. Across from her sat Thomas and his attorney, a man named Gregory, who looked every bit the part of a seasoned litigator. He was calm, composed, and exuded an air of confidence that immediately set Kelly on edge. She tried not to show her nerves, but she could feel her palms sweating and her heart racing in her chest. Gregory wasted no time trying to paint Kelly as the unstable, irrational one in the relationship. His strategy was clear from the start. He was going to discredit her at every turn. He questioned her ability to care for the children, insinuating that her decision to leave the marriage was driven by selfishness and instability rather than any concern for Emma and James's well-being. His tone was sharp, accusing, and designed to make Kelly feel as if she had no right to demand anything. For the first time in her life, Kelly felt completely exposed. The man sitting across from her, representing the man who had been her husband for so long, was doing everything he could to dismantle her entire sense of self. Kelly was no longer the quiet, supportive wife. She was an opponent in a battle for her children's future, and her every word, every action was being scrutinized, twisted, and used against her. Her sense of security, the emotional armor she had built over the years, began to crack. But as the hearing wore on, Kelly found herself growing stronger, more resolute. Every insult, every insinuation, only fueled her determination. She had come too far to turn back now. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Emma and James, for the future they deserved, for a life that wasn't dictated by Thomas's whims or his indifference. Kelly knew that the road ahead would be difficult. She would face more challenges, more attempts to undermine her, but she was no longer the woman she had been at the start of this process. She was a mother, a protector, and she would not back down. Thomas, too, was out of his element. His attempt to portray Kelly as an unfit mother was based on a distorted version of their marriage, one that ignored his own failings as a husband and father. His high-powered lawyer may have been skilled at manipulating the legal system, but he couldn't change the truth. Thomas had been absent for most of the children's lives. He had been emotionally distant, uninterested in the day-to-day activities of parenting, and often too preoccupied with his career to take an active role in their upbringing. But he couldn't admit that. He couldn't admit that he had chosen his career over his family, over his children, time and time again. The weeks that followed were grueling. The court hearings were spaced out, each one more intense than the last. Kelly had to endure deposition after deposition, sitting across from Thomas's lawyer while they grilled her about her parenting, her decisions, her past. There were moments when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, when the emotional weight of the battle felt too much to bear. But then she would think of Emma and James, their innocent faces, their need for a stable home, and she would find the strength to continue. As the custody battle progressed, Kelly began to realize something important. She was not just fighting for her children's physical presence in her life. She was fighting for her own right to be heard, to be seen, to exist outside of the roles she had been assigned. She had spent so long playing the role of the dutiful wife and mother, but this fight was forcing her to step into a new role, the role of the strong, independent woman who would no longer let anyone silence her. This battle was her rebirth. The weeks after the first court hearing were a blur of legal paperwork, strategy meetings with Rebecca, and long nights spent anxiously waiting for updates. Kelly's life had become a series of appointments and deadlines, her every move dictated by the relentless pressure of the custody battle. What had once seemed like a straightforward decision, fighting for her children, had evolved into a war that was taking its toll on every aspect of her life. The emotional weight of the battle, the sense of losing control over her own future, was wearing her down. Yet, amid the chaos, Kelly began to find her footing, carving out a space for herself where she could draw the strength to keep going. At first, Kelly was consumed by self-doubt. Every time she sat in the sterile, intimidating courtroom, she felt the full weight of her vulnerability. She had never been a public speaker, never had to advocate for herself in such a high-stakes environment. Her tendency to be passive, to avoid conflict, seemed to work against her now. The opposing lawyer, Gregory, was an expert at twisting the truth, making small cracks in Kelly's testimony seem like giant fissures. His questions were designed to push her to the edge, to provoke her into a mistake, to show any sign of weakness that he could use to her detriment. The pressure of this constant scrutiny had its effects. Kelly found herself becoming more anxious, more withdrawn. She lost sleep, her appetite, and at times, her belief in her ability to win. She replayed every word she had said in court, every piece of evidence that had been presented, and found herself second-guessing every decision she had made. It seemed that the more she tried to defend herself, the more she ended up alienating herself from her own emotions. The struggle was no longer just a legal one, it had become an internal one. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. Kelly couldn't pinpoint when exactly it happened, but somewhere between the endless hours spent with her lawyer and the countless nights pacing in her apartment, she began to realize something important. She could no longer afford to be the passive participant in her life. She had to take control, not just of the case, but of her own emotional state. No longer could she afford to let the toxic atmosphere of the courtroom and of Thomas's manipulation dictate her sense of self. Kelly started by taking small steps. She began practicing what she would say in front of a mirror, finding her voice, one sentence at a time. She reminded herself of her strengths, of the ways in which she had always been there for Emma and James, how she had sacrificed everything for them. She began to view the battle not just as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to reclaim something precious, her confidence, her agency, and, above all, her children's future. As the next court date approached, Kelly found herself preparing in a way she had never done before. She knew that she had to outmaneuver Thomas's legal team if she stood any chance of getting full custody. She couldn't afford to be passive, to just go along with the flow. Instead, she started actively engaging with Rebecca, studying the law, understanding every possible avenue for strengthening her case. Rebecca, who had initially been somewhat distant, sensing Kelly's hesitations, was now seeing a different side of her client, someone who was determined, focused, and no longer willing to accept defeat. For the first time since the divorce proceedings began, Kelly felt a surge of empowerment. Every document she filed, every phone call she made, every piece of evidence she organized helped her regain a sense of control. She started to realize that her fight was not only about the children, it was about reclaiming her own life, her own identity, and her sense of worth. But even as Kelly grew more resolute, the emotional toll of the battle was undeniable. She had always been the one to hold the family together, to provide comfort to Emma and James in times of uncertainty, but now she was the one who was struggling. Her children were old enough to understand that something was wrong. They could sense the tension in the house, the absence of their father, the emotional weight hanging in the air. Emma, her eldest, had started withdrawing into herself, retreating into her room and spending hours on the phone with her friends, while James, more sensitive, had begun acting out, lashing out at Kelly in moments of frustration. It tore Kelly apart to see them suffering, to feel like she was unable to provide the emotional stability they needed in such a trying time. Yet, in those moments of despair, Kelly found herself leaning into her own strength. She knew she had to keep it together for them. Every morning, she forced herself to get up, to go through the motions of being a mother, of taking care of their needs. It was difficult, but she began to see that even in the darkest times, she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. She began to realize that her emotional resilience, her ability to keep pushing through the pain for the sake of her children, was her greatest asset in this fight. One night, after a particularly intense court session where Gregory had been especially brutal, Kelly collapsed onto her bed, exhausted and defeated. She had tried to stay strong in court, but the emotional toll of the questioning had been overwhelming. Her hands trembled as she held her phone, ready to send a message to Rebecca about her doubts. But then she paused. Something inside her shifted. She had faced too much already to let this break her. The fight for her children's future, for her own future, was too important. She put down the phone and pulled herself back up. Kelly decided to take a break from the case for a day, something that felt foreign and self-indulgent in the midst of such high stakes. She took Emma and James out for a day at the zoo, a simple activity that reminded her of who she was outside of the courtroom, their mother, their protector. Watching Emma and James laugh and play, Kelly realized that despite everything they were going through, they still had joy, still had each other. And so did she. They were a team, bound together by love, even in the face of this overwhelming fight. This day was a turning point. Kelly returned to the case with renewed determination. She knew that the struggle would continue, that there would be more moments of doubt, more setbacks, but she also knew that she had what it took to navigate this new, unfamiliar world. She was learning to fight, not just in the courtroom, but in every aspect of her life. The Kelly who had once been overwhelmed by the thought of confrontation was now beginning to emerge as a woman who understood the power of her own resilience. The process of adapting to the battle for custody had changed Kelly in profound ways. No longer the passive wife or the defeated mother, she had discovered a version of herself she never knew existed. She had learned to trust her instincts, to stand up for herself and for her children. The road ahead was still uncertain, the outcome still in question, but Kelly knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the woman who feared the unknown. She was a mother fighting for her children's future, and nothing would stop her from doing whatever it took to win. As Kelly grew into this new role, she also began to understand the importance of surrounding herself with support. She leaned on her friends more, opened up to her family about the emotional strain she was under, and perhaps most importantly, allowed herself to experience moments of vulnerability. In the past, she had kept everything bottled up inside, believing that showing weakness was a sign of failure. But now, she realized that vulnerability was not a liability, it was a strength. By opening up to others, she was able to lighten the emotional load that had been weighing her down. She was learning, slowly but surely, that it was okay to ask for help, to lean on others when the burden became too heavy. This period of adaptation was not easy, but it was crucial. Kelly was no longer just reacting to the situation. She was learning to navigate it, to rise above the challenges, and to find the strength she needed to push forward. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it complete. But it was a beginning. Kelly was becoming the woman she had always been capable of being, the woman who would stop at nothing to protect her children and herself. Kelly's victory came sooner than she had anticipated, but it was far from the triumph she had envisioned. After weeks of tense court hearings, cross-examinations, and the brutal emotional toll of the proceedings, she had finally received the court's decision. She was awarded primary custody of Emma and James. The judge had ruled in her favor, acknowledging her dedication as a mother and the children's need for stability in the wake of the divorce. It should have been a moment of relief, a moment where Kelly could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that her children would be safe, that they would stay with her. But instead of the sweet satisfaction she had expected, Kelly was left with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. When Rebecca called her with the news, Kelly had barely been able to process the words. At first, she had assumed there had been some mistake. Was it really over? Was she truly the one who had won? But then it sank in. The court had ruled in her favor, and she had succeeded in her battle for custody. It was what she had fought so hard for, what she had sacrificed so much to achieve. And yet, as she sat in her apartment, clutching the phone, she felt nothing but a deep sense of loss. The first wave of disbelief was quickly followed by a gnawing sense of regret. Kelly had won the battle, but at what cost? The custody dispute had taken a toll on everything that had once been important to her. Her relationship with Thomas, once fractured, had been shattered beyond repair. Emma and James, despite being with her, were both deeply affected by the emotional scars of the ongoing battle. Emma, the older of the two, had become increasingly distant, while James, who was more sensitive, had started acting out in ways Kelly couldn't fully understand. Though they were now under her roof full-time, the emotional distance between them all seemed to grow with each passing day. Kelly had spent years trying to hold her family together, trying to protect Emma and James from the worst parts of the dysfunction between her and Thomas. But now, despite her success in securing their custody, she realized that the damage had already been done. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that none of them knew how to address. The once warm and comfortable family home had become a place of sorrow and unfulfilled promises. As the weeks wore on, Kelly found herself questioning the very nature of her victory. She had always believed that securing full custody would be the ultimate way to protect her children, that it would ensure their safety and happiness. But now, she saw the cracks in that belief. Emma's withdrawn demeanor, her increasing silence, spoke volumes about the emotional strain the divorce and custody battle had caused her. James's frustration was no less painful to witness. His once bright and cheerful spirit seemed dulled, as if the weight of the tension between Kelly and Thomas had eroded his trust in the stability of the world around him. Kelly also realized that the victory had come at the cost of her own peace of mind. The constant stress of the custody hearings had left her emotionally drained, her energy depleted. She was so focused on the fight itself that she had neglected to take care of her own well-being. The months of sleepless nights, the endless preparations for court, the isolation from her friends and family, all of it had taken a toll on her mental health. Now that the battle was over, she felt as though she were running on empty, with no idea how to repair the emotional damage caused by the war she had just fought. She had won custody, but the victory felt hollow, as though something essential had been lost in the process. Kelly had expected that this achievement would bring her a sense of relief, of closure, but instead it brought a sense of loneliness. She had fought to keep her children close, to ensure that she could be there for them in every way, but now, she found herself adrift. The fight for custody had consumed her so completely that she had lost sight of the connection she had once shared with Emma and James. The strain of the battle had created an emotional gulf between them, and now, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to bridge that gap. The realization that her victory might not be what she had hoped for weighed heavily on Kelly's heart. The court's decision had not magically restored her family. It hadn't healed the wounds that the divorce and the battle had inflicted. The damage was deep, and Kelly was beginning to see that there was no easy way to fix it. She couldn't simply move on from the battle and expect everything to return to normal. There was no simple solution to the emotional fallout of her victory. Meanwhile, Thomas's reaction to the ruling was exactly what Kelly had expected. He was furious, and it was clear that he was not going to let this setback go without a fight. In the days following the decision, Thomas began to make his anger known. He blamed Kelly for everything, accusing her of turning their children against him, of manipulating the situation to her advantage. His bitterness and resentment toward her only deepened, and Kelly could feel the tension between them growing with every passing day. He had lost the battle for custody, but he had not given up the war. Kelly had no illusions about what this meant. She had won the custody battle, but the fight for her children's future, both emotionally and psychologically, was far from over. The weeks turned into months, and the emotional strain began to take its toll on everyone in the family. Kelly struggled with feelings of guilt. Had she done the right thing by pushing for full custody? She couldn't help but question whether there had been another way, a better way to protect her children, a way that wouldn't have required such a violent confrontation with Thomas. But as much as she wanted to convince herself that there had been another option, she couldn't deny the truth. The custody battle had been inevitable. Thomas had left her no choice. In an point to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Kelly started seeking therapy. She began seeing a counselor to help her process the emotional and psychological impact of the divorce and the custody battle. At first, she resisted the idea of therapy, believing that she could handle everything on her own. But as she spoke to the counselor, she began to realize just how deeply the experience had affected her. She had put everything into the fight, her energy, her focus, her emotional reserves, but she had neglected to take care of the parts of herself that needed healing. The counselor helped her see that her victory in the courtroom hadn't been the end of her journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where healing and rebuilding would take center stage. Kelly's therapy sessions became a place where she could reflect on the deeper issues that had led to the breakdown of her marriage, the emotional damage caused by years of neglect, and the difficult decision to fight for custody. Through these sessions, she started to gain clarity about what she really needed, not just for her children, but for herself. She had spent so much time fighting for Emma and James, trying to shield them from the fallout of the divorce, that she had forgotten to consider her own needs. The therapist encouraged her to take time for herself, to acknowledge the pain she had been carrying, and to begin working through the grief of the divorce, the loss of her family, and the impact it had on her own identity. The emotional toll of winning custody was something Kelly hadn't anticipated. She had won the fight she had set out to win, but it hadn't come with the satisfaction she expected. Instead, it had created a new set of challenges, ones that were even more difficult to face than the courtroom battles. Kelly realized that her quest for control, for the certainty that her children would be safe, had come at the cost of something far more fragile and irreplaceable, her connection with them and with herself. As time passed, Kelly began to understand that the real work lay not in the custody ruling itself, but in rebuilding the relationships that had been fractured by the intense pressure of the battle. She could not simply claim victory and move on. The emotional healing of her family, including herself, was the next step, and it would be just as difficult and uncertain as the legal war she had just fought. The victory, as it turned out, was not the end. It was only the beginning of a much more complex and painful journey. The weeks following the court ruling seemed to blur together, each day blending into the next, as Kelly tried to move forward with the new reality that had been thrust upon her. She had won custody of Emma and James, but the emotional aftermath of the battle was proving far more difficult to handle than the legal proceedings themselves. The children were living with her now, and while she had fought for this outcome, she could not escape the gnawing sense that she had paid a far higher price than she had anticipated. She had not just lost her marriage and her relationship with Thomas, she had lost a piece of herself, too. Each morning, Kelly would wake up early, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the children, who still struggled to adjust to the new living arrangements. Despite being with her full-time, Emma and James were distant, emotionally detached, and Kelly found herself constantly walking on eggshells around them. Her once lively, bustling household had become a place of silence and tension, and every attempt to bond with her children seemed to fall flat. No matter how hard she tried to reassure them, to convince them that things would get better, she couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. Emma, in particular, had become more distant than ever. The once gregarious teenager now spent most of her time in her room, scrolling through her phone or listening to music with her headphones on. She rarely spoke to Kelly, and when she did, her words were curt and laced with bitterness. Kelly could see that Emma blamed her for the way things had turned out, even if she couldn't articulate it. Emma had been closer to her father than Kelly had realized, and the intensity of the divorce, coupled with the custody battle, had torn that bond apart. Emma's hurt was palpable, but Kelly couldn't seem to find a way to bridge the gap between them. James, on the other hand, had become more emotional, prone to outbursts of anger and frustration. His once bright and happy demeanor was gone, replaced by a sullen quietness that seemed to hang over the house like a dark cloud. He didn't understand why Thomas wasn't around anymore, why his father couldn't just come and pick him up like he used to. The change in their family dynamic was too much for him to process. James had always been the more sensitive of the two children, and now, his emotional turmoil was something Kelly couldn't ignore. He was angry at the world, angry at his father, angry at her, and, most heartbreakingly of all, angry at himself. As much as Kelly tried to reach out to her children, her efforts were met with resistance. She felt isolated, trapped in a role that no longer felt like her own. The mother she had once been, nurturing, patient, loving, felt like a ghost of the past. She had spent so much time fighting for their future that she had failed to notice how much she was losing in the present. She had wanted to protect them, but now, in the silence of her home, Kelly couldn't help but wonder if she had done more harm than good. It wasn't just her relationship with the children that was strained. Kelly's own mental and emotional state had deteriorated rapidly in the aftermath of the trial. The months of stress, the constant anxiety of the court dates, the endless preparation, and the emotional toll of her victory had left her exhausted, both physically and mentally. She had poured everything into the battle, convinced that the end result would bring her peace, but now that the fight was over, she felt emptier than she had ever felt before. Kelly had no idea how to deal with the guilt that weighed heavily on her chest. She had thought that winning the custody battle would solve everything, that if she could just keep her children with her, everything would somehow fall back into place. But now, with the weight of her decisions settling in, she realized how wrong she had been. The emotional cost of the battle was too high. She had sacrificed too much. She had allowed her life to be consumed by the fight, and now, she didn't know how to get back to the place she had once been. The guilt was compounded by the sense of betrayal she felt from her friends and family. When the custody battle had started, Kelly had felt like she had the support of those around her. Her friends had rallied behind her, offering words of encouragement, and her parents had been steadfast in their belief that she was doing the right thing. But as the months went on, the cracks began to show. Kelly's closest friends, unable to understand the complexity of the situation, began to distance themselves. They didn't know what to say when Kelly confided in them about the emotional toll the custody battle had taken on her, and so they remained silent. Her family, too, seemed to have begun questioning her decisions. Her mother, who had always been her rock, seemed unable to offer the same level of unwavering support. Instead, she gave Kelly pointed looks and hesitant words of advice, as if she, too, was unsure whether the cost of winning had been worth it. Kelly couldn't help but feel that her world was falling apart. The very people who had stood by her now seemed unsure, and Kelly began to question whether they, too, believed that she had made the wrong choice. It was around this time that Thomas began making his presence known in more insidious ways. While he had never been a particularly involved or attentive father, the loss of custody seemed to awaken a part of him that Kelly had never seen before. He began making threatening phone calls, accusing her of turning the children against him, of denying him his rightful place in their lives. He was bitter, and his anger was palpable. Kelly had expected this, of course, but the intensity of his words, the venom behind his accusations, took her by surprise. The most disturbing part of it all was how his anger was starting to affect the children. Emma and James, already emotionally fragile from the divorce, were now being caught in the middle of a war that seemed to have no end. Thomas's attempts to manipulate them were becoming more apparent. He would call them when Kelly wasn't around, trying to plant seeds of doubt in their minds, telling them that she was the one who had ruined their family. Kelly couldn't stop it, no matter how hard she tried to shield them from his influence. As the weeks passed, Kelly realized that no matter what she did, the damage had already been done. She had won the custody battle, but she had lost something far more important in the process: the trust of her children, the support of her friends and family, and her own sense of peace. The victory that had once seemed so sweet now tasted like ashes in her mouth. There was no escaping the harsh reality that she had paid a heavy price for her actions. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. Kelly found herself questioning her ability as a mother, doubting her decisions at every turn. The constant guilt and regret gnawed at her, and she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of her own making. She had wanted to protect her children, to give them a stable future, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed them in ways she could never undo. It wasn't until a quiet evening, when she sat alone in her living room, staring at the empty space where Emma and James used to be, that Kelly truly understood the magnitude of the consequences she had brought upon herself. The children were at a friend's house, and the house felt eerily still. For the first time since the custody battle had begun, Kelly allowed herself to truly feel the weight of the losses she had endured. She had won the battle for custody, but she had lost her family. In that moment, she realized that winning was never enough. She had thought that securing custody would give her the peace of mind she so desperately needed, but it had only left her with more questions, more doubts. What was the point of winning if the cost was her own happiness, the emotional well-being of her children, and the sense of belonging she had once shared with her family? She had been so focused on the future, on the goal of protecting her children, that she had forgotten the importance of healing the wounds of the present. Kelly understood, in that quiet moment of reflection, that she had to start over. She had to rebuild her relationships, not just with Emma and James, but with herself. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but it was the only path she could take. She could not undo the past, but she could begin to heal from it. And perhaps, just perhaps, through that healing, she could find a way back to the family she had once hoped to preserve. It had been months since the court ruling, but Kelly's life still felt like a fragile house of cards, one wrong move away from tumbling down. The emotional and psychological toll of the custody battle had changed her in ways she wasn't ready to admit to herself, let alone to others. Yet, as she sat quietly in the living room one Saturday afternoon, watching Emma and James play in the backyard, she realized that the dust had begun to settle. Not perfectly, but enough to allow for a glimmer of hope. She was beginning to understand that no matter how much she wanted to rewrite the past, she couldn't. What mattered now was how she chose to rebuild, and that process started with her own growth. For months, Kelly had been consumed by guilt. She had fought so hard for what she thought was best for her children, but it had come at the expense of her relationships, her own sense of peace, and, most devastatingly, the trust she had once shared with Emma and James. However, with time, and with the help of therapy, she began to come to terms with the fact that the battle was not as black and white as she had once imagined. She had made mistakes, yes, but she had also acted out of a desire to protect her children. It was a flawed and imperfect journey, but it was hers, and the only way to move forward was to accept both the victories and the losses. Kelly's first step in this new chapter was to mend her relationship with Emma. The silence that had settled between them had been unbearable, and Kelly knew that she could no longer wait for her daughter to come to her. She had to be the one to take the first step, to break the emotional wall that had grown between them. So, one evening, after dinner, Kelly sat Emma down at the kitchen table. Her heart raced as she prepared for the conversation, unsure of what to expect, but determined to be honest. "Emma," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I know that things have been hard between us, and I know I made mistakes during all of this." She gestured between them, referring to the divorce, the custody battle, and everything that had come before. "I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best for you, for all of us. But I see now that I might have lost sight of you in the process." Emma didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at the table, avoiding Kelly's gaze. Kelly's heart broke at the sight of her daughter's sadness, the years of warmth and closeness between them seeming like a distant memory. But Kelly pressed on, determined not to let the silence remain. "I want to try to understand how you feel," she said softly. "And I want us to find a way back to each other. I don't expect it to be easy, and I know it will take time. But I'm here, Emma. I'm here for you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in months, she spoke. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Mom. I don't know who's right or wrong. All I know is that everything's changed, and I don't know how to fix it." The words stung, but Kelly understood. Her daughter was grieving too, grieving not just the loss of her relationship with her father, but the upheaval of everything she had known. The trust Emma had in both of her parents had been shattered. They were no longer the safe, predictable figures she once thought they were. "I don't have all the answers," Kelly said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, I'm going to try to be the mother you need. And I'll do whatever it takes to help you heal from all of this." It wasn't an instant fix. Emma didn't immediately open up, and it took weeks for them to begin to rebuild their bond. But that moment, the moment Kelly finally admitted her mistakes and put her heart on the line, was the first real step toward healing. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but with every passing day, the space between them grew smaller. For James, the process was equally slow but different. James wasn't as guarded as Emma, but his anger and frustration were harder to address. Kelly knew that his emotional turmoil ran deep. He missed his father terribly, and his outbursts, his temper, his fits of crying, were all signs of how he was struggling to process the change. Kelly knew she had to be patient, that James would need time, but she also knew that she could no longer just stand by, watching him suffer in silence. She began to spend more one-on-one time with him. They took walks together, something they had done often before the divorce. She talked to him about his feelings, but mostly she listened. Slowly but surely, James began to open up to her, revealing the confusion and sadness he had been carrying with him. He missed his dad. He hated how things had turned out. But most of all, he hated the fact that he couldn't fix it. He couldn't bring his family back together. "I don't know what's going to happen," Kelly told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "But I do know this, no matter what, I will always love you. And I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, James. I'm not going to leave you." James didn't say anything, but the tears in his eyes spoke volumes. The next day, he came to her with a drawing he had done, depicting their family, Emma, James, and Kelly, all together. It wasn't perfect. It was far from the ideal picture of happiness, but it was something. It was a sign that, at least for the moment, James was beginning to trust her again, and that was all Kelly could ask for. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as Kelly worked to rebuild her relationship with her children, she began to rediscover pieces of herself she had lost along the way. She remembered the woman she had once been before the divorce, the woman who had dreamed of a family that was whole and happy. That woman had been lost in the fight, buried under the weight of the emotional turmoil she had been living with. But as she spent time with Emma and James, both separately and together, she realized that while things could never go back to what they were, they could move forward. She also began to reclaim her sense of self. For so long, she had been defined by the divorce, by the custody battle, by her role as a mother. But she started taking time for herself again, doing things that brought her joy, writing in her journal, visiting friends, and even reconnecting with some of her old hobbies. She re-established boundaries with Thomas, refusing to let his anger and bitterness continue to affect her emotional well-being. It wasn't easy, but she made a promise to herself. She would no longer be held hostage by the past. The most important shift, however, was in Kelly's understanding of what it meant to be a parent. She had always believed that protecting her children meant winning the fight, securing custody, and keeping them with her at all costs. But through the long, difficult months after the trial, she had learned that true protection came from emotional honesty, from vulnerability, and from showing her children that it was okay to grieve, to feel hurt, and to be imperfect. And through it all, Kelly began to realize that while she couldn't undo the past, she could shape their future. They would move forward as a family, not the same family as before, but a family nonetheless. And in that process, Kelly began to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made along the way. One evening, months after their initial conversation, Kelly and Emma sat together on the couch, watching a movie, just like they used to do. Emma leaned her head on Kelly's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, Kelly felt the warmth of the connection they had once shared. They weren't healed. Not yet. But they were on their way. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, breaking the silence. "You have nothing to apologize for," Kelly replied softly, stroking her daughter's hair. Emma smiled weakly. "Maybe not, but I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to understand, to forgive." Kelly kissed her forehead gently. "And I'm here, every step of the way." As the movie played on, neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them was no longer charged with tension. It was peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Kelly felt like they were moving forward, not just as mother and daughter, but as a family. A broken family, yes, but a family nonetheless. Kelly knew that the road ahead would still have its bumps and twists, but now, armed with the wisdom of her journey, she was ready to face them. She had learned that healing didn't happen overnight, that sometimes the hardest part wasn't the battle itself, but the aftermath. The price she had paid for custody had been steep, but through it all, she had found a new truth. Life wasn't about perfection. It was about growth. And perhaps that was the only thing she truly needed.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.